What happens when you mock a man's hard work in front of friends, believing it makes you clever, only to watch him quietly erase you from his life? I thought my joke was harmless, but it ended everything. My name is Marina Hale. I am 33 years old, and I once believed humor made me clever. That sarcasm proved strength, that mocking Ryan only showed my charm. Ryan Hale, my husband of 9 years, was 36, a construction project manager, steady, loyal, hard-working, the kind of man people respect quietly. I told myself his job was unimpressive, ordinary, beneath me, and I used it as material to make myself look superior. I laughed about his steel-toed boots, about his early mornings, about his dusty clothes, pretending it was harmless teasing, while others smirked. My friends Sophie, Dana, and Claire clapped along, their laughter fueling my arrogance, while Trevor from work told me it proved I was witty. But Ryan's mother, Linda, narrowed her eyes when she overheard. His father, Paul, stayed silent, and both of them saw the disrespect I refused to admit. I thought mocking him was just play, thought he would shrug, thought loyalty meant he would stay regardless, but I did not see his silence growing heavier. Now Ryan has fired me from his life entirely, leaving me forgotten while he thrives without me. The truth is that my mockery began long before that dinner, long before the friends gathered, long before the public humiliation that ended everything. It started quietly in our living room, in casual comments I called jokes, in sarcastic lines I thought were harmless. Ryan would come home late, his shirt dusty, his boots leaving tracks on the mat, his shoulders heavy from managing crews at job sites. He would sit at the table, rubbing his temples, telling me about contractors who missed deadlines or inspections that dragged longer than expected. I would nod, half listening, scrolling on my phone, then cut him off with a laugh about how boring construction sounded compared to real work. I told myself I was being playful, that teasing kept things light, that humor was our love language, but deep down I knew I was belittling him. Each time he fell silent, folding his napkin carefully or adjusting his papers, I mistook his quietness for tolerance, mistook his patience for weakness. The next day, I would repeat my jokes to Sophie or Dana during lunch, telling them Ryan spent hours talking about scaffolding or cement mixes, and they would laugh. Their laughter validated me, convinced me I was witty, convinced me I was clever, convinced me my words were harmless fun. Trevor from the office fueled it too, smirking when I called Ryan a glorified foreman, telling me my husband was lucky to have someone sharp like me. I ate up that attention, feeling superior each time people laughed at Ryan's expense, telling myself it was just words, just jokes, nothing serious. Ryan never fought back, never raised his voice, never defended himself with anger, and I told myself that meant he didn't care. I convinced myself he could handle it, convinced myself silence meant acceptance, convinced myself he was immune to humiliation. Linda, however, noticed earlier than anyone. At a small family lunch, I joked about Ryan's work boots being his best shoes, laughing while Sophie nodded beside me, but Linda's eyes hardened. She said Ryan's work paid for everything we had, said his discipline built our home, said mocking him showed disrespect, but I waved her off. I told her I was only joking, told her she had no sense of humor, told her she was being dramatic, and Ryan stayed silent. Paul didn't say much either, but his eyes carried the same weight as Linda's words, disappointment sitting heavy in the air between us. I laughed louder, convinced I was winning, convinced I had silenced them with charm, but their expression stayed sharp, and I ignored the warning. At home, the silence grew heavier each evening. Ryan would sit with his paperwork, carefully sorting receipts, checking numbers, reviewing contracts, while I filled the room with sarcastic remarks. I mocked the endless paperwork, called him an accountant with dirty boots, laughed at how he cared more about pipes than people. He didn't answer, didn't look at me, didn't even sigh, only kept his focus on the folder he had started carrying everywhere. I thought it was work, thought it was another contract, thought it was just business, but part of me suspected it was something else. When I asked once what he was working on, he said nothing at all, only closed the folder neatly and slid it into his briefcase. His silence unnerved me, but I covered it with more laughter, telling myself I was untouchable. telling myself loyalty meant he would never leave. Sophie, Dana, and Claire loved my stories. Over wine, I would tell them Ryan talked about safety regulations or project delays, and they would giggle, telling me I was too funny, telling me Ryan really did sound dull. Their encouragement pushed me further, convinced me I was entertaining, convinced me mockery was power, convinced me disrespect was cleverness. I never realized their laughter was shallow, nervous sometimes, uncomfortable at other times, and that I was making myself look cruel. At work, Trevor egged me on too, telling me Ryan was just a laborer with a title, telling me I was destined for more than a man like that. His words stoked my arrogance, made me feel cleverer, made me feel superior, even as my marriage crumbled quietly beneath silence. One night, Ryan came home later than usual, his shirt damp from rain, his hair sticking slightly to his forehead, his folder tucked under his arm. He kissed my cheek lightly, then moved straight to the desk, opening the folder, sliding papers neatly into place, his focus unwavering. I made another joke, something about how his life was a stack of invoices, how romance for him meant a balanced spreadsheet, and I laughed loudly. He didn't even look at me, only kept working, his hands steady, his posture calm, his silence heavier than stone. For a moment, I felt something strange, fear maybe, but I shoved it down, convincing myself silence was surrender. I poured a glass of wine, turned up the television, and declared to myself that I was still in control. Looking back, this was the first stage of my downfall, though I refused to see it then. Ryan's silence wasn't weakness, it was resolve. His patience wasn't surrender, it was planning. His calm wasn't emptiness, it was strength. I believed I was the clever one, believed my jokes proved superiority, believed his silence gave me power, but I was blind. The folder he carried was more than work, it was preparation, and each paper he filed was another step toward the life he would build without me. And still, I laughed louder, convinced sarcasm made me charming, convinced mockery kept me strong, convinced my words could never truly hurt him. But the truth was, they were cutting deeper than I realized, and each silent evening was another nail in the coffin of my marriage. The night of the dinner with friends should have been fun, just wine, laughter, and stories, but I turned it into a stage for myself. We gathered at Claire's apartment, the table filled with pasta, salad, bottles of wine, the music low, the atmosphere warm, and Ryan sat quietly beside me. Sophie leaned across the table asking about Ryan's work, and before he could answer, I cut him off with a laugh, saying everyone knew he just shuffled papers and told men where to dig. The girls laughed, their glasses clinking, their eyes glancing between us, and I felt triumphant, convinced I was clever, convinced humor proved my strength. Ryan's lips pressed together slightly, his eyes lowering to his plate, his fork moving slowly, and I mistook that silence for indifference. I kept going, exaggerating his stories, mocking the way he came home talking about scaffolding or permits, painting him as dull, ordinary beneath me. I told them he once spent 20 minutes explaining a drainage issue, and I rolled my eyes as if repeating it made me powerful. They laughed again, though not as loudly, and I noticed Dana's smile falter, Claire shifting uncomfortably, Sophie pouring more wine without speaking. I ignored those details, too focused on the spotlight, too hungry for validation, too addicted to the sound of laughter at his expense. Ryan remained silent, sipping his water, folding his napkin, keeping his posture steady, and I grew louder because his calmness made me feel desperate. I needed him to fight, needed him to defend himself, needed him to give me something I could twist, but he gave me nothing. At one point, Trevor showed up, invited by Claire because he knew some of her co-workers, and his smirk encouraged me further. He leaned back, sipping his beer, telling me I was hilarious, telling me I should be a comedian, telling me Ryan was lucky to have someone sharp enough to joke like this. That fueled my arrogance, made me bolder, made me crueler, because I wanted to prove myself in front of Trevor especially. I mocked Ryan's boots, saying they were more beat up than our welcome mat, mocked his hard hat, saying it looked like a child's toy, mocked his work hours, saying only desperate men woke up before dawn. Trevor chuckled loudly, slapping the table. while the others smiled awkwardly, and I kept going, intoxicated by the sound of his approval. But then I caught sight of Ryan's eyes, calm but heavy, not angry, not sad, just detached, as if he had already walked away in his mind. That look unnerved me, made my voice crack for a moment, made my hand shake slightly as I lifted my glass, but I shoved it down. I made another joke, louder, harsher, painting him as dull compared to men like Trevor, and I felt the room shift colder. Dana set her fork down, her voice soft but firm, as she asked if I wasn't being a little harsh, but I brushed her off. I said Ryan didn't care, said he knew it was all jokes, said our marriage was strong enough to handle laughter, but my voice sounded defensive even to myself. Ryan said nothing, offered nothing, only kept eating slowly, his silence heavier than judgment, his calmness unbearable. The dinner dragged on, conversations shifting awkwardly to other topics, laughter forced, tension lingering, but I could not stop myself from adding jabs whenever Ryan's work came up. Each joke felt hollower, each laugh weaker, each silence sharper, but I pressed forward because stopping would have meant admitting shame. I told myself everyone admired me for being bold, told myself they envied my wit, told myself Ryan's silence meant surrender, but the truth was obvious in their eyes, and I ignored it. Toward the end, Ryan stood, his movement slow, deliberate, folding his napkin neatly, placing it beside his plate, and excusing himself quietly. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't shout, just left the table with calm dignity that silenced even Trevor's smirk. The room felt heavy after he walked out, the laughter gone, the tension suffocating, the air thick with judgment I pretended not to notice. Dinah shook her head slightly. Sophie looked down at her plate, Claire avoided my eyes, and even Trevor smirked less, suddenly quiet. I laughed loudly, raising my glass, insisting Ryan was just sensitive, insisting he always left early, insisting I was only joking, but nobody laughed with me. My words hung heavy in the silence, falling flat, exposing me instead of entertaining, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks despite the wine. The spotlight I had craved so desperately had turned into a mirror, showing everyone who I really was, and I hated it. When I got home later, Ryan was sitting in the living room, his folder beside him, his posture calm, his eyes unreadable. I tried to joke again, saying he had embarrassed me by leaving, saying he had made me look bad, saying he should have played along, but he said nothing. He only looked at me once, his eyes steady, then turned back to his papers, his silence thicker than walls. That silence rattled me more than shouting would have, because it meant he was done engaging, done reacting, done giving me fuel. I stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door, convincing myself he would forgive me, convincing myself silence was weakness, convincing myself I was still in control. Looking back, that dinner was the turning point, the moment my arrogance was exposed to everyone, the moment Ryan's silence became stronger than my mockery. I thought I was clever, thought I was powerful, thought jokes gave me charm, but instead they revealed me as cruel. My friends saw it, my co-workers saw it, my husband saw it, and I was too blind to recognize the damage. Ryan's silence was not surrender, it was strength, his calmness not weakness, it was resolve, his detachment not emptiness, it was preparation. I left that dinner convinced I had won, but the truth was I had lost everything already. His silence that night was the sound of a marriage ending, and I laughed too loudly to hear it. The fallout from that dinner spread faster than I expected, slipping into conversations I wasn't part of, appearing in glances from friends, echoing through family whispers. By the weekend, we were at Ryan's parents' house for Sunday lunch, and I arrived rehearsing excuses, already prepared to spin the story. The table was set neatly, roast chicken steaming, glasses shining, the house smelling of herbs, and Ryan sat beside me in complete silence. Linda greeted him warmly, her arms tight, her voice full of pride, but her eyes turned sharp when they landed on me, and I felt judgment before anyone spoke. Paul shook Ryan's hand firmly, nodding with approval, his quiet dignity obvious, and then everyone sat down, the clinking of forks filling the silence. I began speaking loudly, trying to control the narrative, telling them the dinner with friends had been harmless, just jokes, nothing serious, nothing cruel. I said Ryan had overreacted, said he was too sensitive, said he didn't understand humor, and I laughed loudly, hoping someone would join me. But Linda set her fork down with a sharp sound, her eyes locked on mine, her voice calm but firm, as she said, disrespect was not humor. She told me Ryan worked harder than anyone, told me his dedication paid for everything, told me mocking him was shameful, and I felt heat in my chest. I tried to argue, saying everyone teased their spouses, saying humor kept marriages alive, saying I was misunderstood, but my voice shook slightly. Paul finally spoke, his tone quiet but heavy, saying loyalty mattered more than cleverness, saying words had weight, saying my arrogance was hurting his son. Ryan sat silent through it all, eating slowly, folding his napkin, sipping his water, never defending me, never explaining, never even raising his voice. His calmness was unbearable, because I had no way to twist it, no way to fight it, no way to spin it into victory. I turned to Sophie for backup, reminding her of the laughs at the dinner, but she only gave me a weak smile and said little. Even Claire, who once clapped at my sarcasm, avoided my eyes, her silence sharp, her discomfort obvious, her loyalty shifting away from me. I realized then that my allies were fading, their laughter gone, their support evaporating, and I stood alone against a wall of disapproval. Still, I refused to surrender, doubling down on excuses, telling Linda she was too serious, telling Paul he was too traditional, telling Ryan he should lighten up. But the silence after each word cut deeper, the absence of agreement louder than any laughter, the weight of judgment suffocating. Ryan finally placed his fork neatly on the plate, excused himself quietly, and walked from the table, leaving me alone again. That calm retreat humiliated me more than if he had shouted, because it left me exposed, left me flailing, left me cruel without contrast. Linda's eyes followed him with pride, then returned to me with coldness, her voice saying directly that I was breaking my own marriage. Paul gave me nothing but silence, his disappointment carved deeper than anger, his loyalty tied firmly to his son, and I hated the emptiness in his gaze. After lunch, I tried to speak to Ryan in the car, telling him he embarrassed me by leaving, telling him he made me look bad, telling him his silence was worse than fighting. He said nothing, kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the wheel, his posture unshakable, and I felt powerless beside him. That silence stretched into the following weeks, the house emptier somehow even when he was home, his presence detached, his focus always on the folder he carried. He stayed later at work, came home quieter, left earlier, moved through rooms like a shadow, and I began to sense the shift. I accused him of avoiding me, accused him of sulking, accused him of punishing me, but he gave me no response, no reaction, no leverage. I poured glasses of wine, laughed too loudly, posted online about freedom, but deep down I felt the walls closing in. Even my friends stopped answering as quickly. Sophie avoiding calls, Claire sending short messages, Dana saying she was busy, their distance obvious, their loyalty gone. Trevor still smirked at work, telling me I was hilarious, telling me Ryan was weak, telling me I deserved better, but his words rang hollow. He offered no real loyalty, no real support, only shallow praise, only fuel for arrogance, and even that fuel began to taste bitter. Meanwhile, Ryan's dignity grew in contrast, his silence turning into strength, his calmness making others admire him more. Neighbors spoke kindly about him, colleagues praised his leadership, even friends who once laughed at my jokes now sided with him. I told myself they were blind, told myself they were boring, told myself they didn't understand, but the truth was clear. I was the only one left mocking. One night I came home late from Sophie's place, wine on my breath, jokes rehearsed, ready to pick a fight, but Ryan wasn't there. His shoes were gone, his folder missing, the house too quiet, and I realized he had stayed away intentionally. He came home the next morning calm, rested, carrying the folder, his eyes steady, and I knew instantly it was no accident. He was staying away by choice, removing himself from me, preparing something larger, something final. I asked him directly if he was leaving me, begged him to answer, demanded some reaction, but he gave me silence again. That silence was worse than rage, worse than arguments, worse than anything, because it meant he had already decided, already walked away in his mind. Looking back, that family lunch was the second stage of my downfall, the moment the larger world began siding openly with Ryan, the moment my arrogance lost its audience. I thought humor proved cleverness, but it exposed cruelty, thought silence was weakness, but it revealed power, thought loyalty guaranteed forgiveness, but it was the rope I had cut. Ryan's parents sided against me, my friends drifted away, my husband retreated into silence, and I laughed too loudly to admit the truth. The marriage was already gone, the respect already destroyed, the foundation already cracked, and I was too blind to see it. Ryan's silence was no longer just patience, it was strategy, and I was the only one pretending jokes could cover cruelty. By the following month, gossip had reached every corner of my life, and suddenly, I was no longer the clever wife making jokes, but the cruel woman tearing down a good man. At work, I overheard whispers from colleagues who once laughed at my sarcasm, now shaking their heads, now lowering their voices when I entered the room. Neighbors who used to wave at me across driveways now avoided eye contact, their conversation stopping abruptly as I walked past, their silence louder than judgment. Even Sophie, who once clapped along with my stories, now answered my calls less often, her tone clipped, her loyalty fading. Dana stopped coming around completely. Claire's messages grew shorter, and the circle I had depended on for validation unraveled quickly. Trevor remained, but his smirks and empty compliments felt hollow, his shallow praise nothing more than fuel for arrogance I no longer fully believed. Meanwhile, Ryan moved through the world differently, carrying himself with a dignity that drew respect quietly from everyone around him. He worked longer hours, returned calmer, spoke less, but when he did, people leaned in, admired him, listened with patience. I noticed neighbors greeting him warmly, colleagues shaking his hand firmly, even family friends praising him openly for his strength and steadiness. Linda and Paul beamed with pride whenever his name was mentioned, their loyalty solid, their support unshakable, their respect only growing. Each time I heard someone praise him, my stomach twisted with jealousy, because the man I had mocked as boring was now admired as dignified. His silence, which I once mistook for weakness, was now recognized as power, and I felt myself shrinking in comparison. At social gatherings, I tried to reclaim control of the narrative, spinning the same tired lines, insisting I had only been joking, insisting Ryan had overreacted, insisting people were misunderstanding my humor. But each attempt fell flat, met with awkward silence, uncomfortable glances, or half-hearted nods from people who clearly no longer believed me. I could feel myself becoming the villain in every room, the one people judged quietly, the one nobody wanted to defend. Even Amber, who once encouraged me in everything, had stopped replying entirely, her silence proof she had abandoned me too. I told myself these people were humorless, too uptight, too traditional, but deep down I knew the truth. I was losing everyone. Ryan, on the other hand, was gaining more than ever. He attended community meetings, volunteered for projects, and built connections that impressed even those who barely knew him. He carried himself with calmness, with strength, with quiet determination, and people gravitated toward that steadiness. I watched it happen, powerless, humiliated, realizing I had been the one tearing him down while he had been building something lasting. My words had burned bridges, his silence had built foundations, and the contrast between us grew clearer with each passing week. Friends who once praised me now praised him. Family who once tolerated me now excluded me. Colleagues who once laughed at my jokes now avoided me. I told myself it was unfair, told myself people were blind, told myself I was misunderstood, but the mirror showed me clearly. I was the problem. At home, the distance between us grew unbearable. Ryan came home later and later, his shoes quieter, his voice softer, his presence fading like smoke. He no longer ate dinner with me, no longer shared small updates, no longer gave me any pieces of himself. He focused on the folder, always on the folder, stacking papers, organizing documents, reviewing pages with a precision that terrified me. I knew it wasn't just work, knew it wasn't just contracts, knew it was something larger, something final, but I avoided asking directly. When I tried to corner him, demanded to know what he was planning, begged for an answer, he gave me the same silence. That silence was colder now, sharper now, final somehow, and I felt fear creeping in despite my bravado. Linda stopped answering my calls altogether, her judgment complete, her rejection sharp, her absence heavier than words. Paul gave me nothing either. No calls, no texts, no visits, only silence that carried disappointment more clearly than any speech. The family I once belonged to had erased me completely, their loyalty tied only to Ryan, their pride swelling as he thrived without my support. I tried to convince myself they had always disliked me, that they had poisoned him against me, that they were unfair, but the truth was simpler. They had loved their son, respected his loyalty, admired his strength, and I had mocked all of it until they could not forgive me. One evening, I came home to find Ryan gone again, but this time the folder was missing too, and my chest tightened instantly. He returned later, calm, steady, placing the folder back on the desk, sliding papers neatly inside, ignoring my frantic questions. I demanded to know where he had gone, demanded to know what he was hiding, demanded to know if he planned to leave me, but his silence never cracked. He brushed past me, adjusted his jacket, and went to bed quietly, leaving me shaking with rage and fear. I poured another drink, pacing the living room, laughing loudly to myself, convincing myself he wouldn't dare leave, convincing myself silence always meant hesitation. But deep down, I knew what that folder represented. I knew it was my undoing. Looking back, this was the third stage of my downfall. The moment Ryan's silence gained public power, while my noise lost all meaning. I thought I could control the story, but I couldn't. Thought people would laugh forever, but they didn't. Thought loyalty guaranteed forgiveness, but it didn't. My jokes were no longer funny, my excuses no longer convincing, my arrogance no longer admired, and all that remained was judgment. Ryan's silence had become strength, admired, respected, praised, while my noise had become cruelty, condemned, rejected, despised. I was unraveling, desperate, frantic, while he was building, calm, steady, certain, and I knew the balance had shifted forever. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was preparation, and my words weren't cleverness, they were destruction. The day the truth arrived was colder than expected, the sky grey, the air heavy, the silence in the house unbearable. I found the envelope on the kitchen counter, thick, official, my name written clearly, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside were papers from a lawyer's office, documents outlining separation, division of assets, signatures waiting for ink. Attached were pages of records, receipts, photos, details too precise, too careful, evidence Ryan had been collecting for months while I laughed. There were screenshots of messages, records of late nights, even statements from people who had witnessed my so-called jokes, each piece a nail in the coffin of my marriage. My chest tightened, my face burned, because his silence had not been surrender, it had been preparation, and I had been blind. I poured a glass of wine immediately, telling myself he wouldn't go through with it, telling myself it was a bluff, telling myself loyalty always won. But when Ryan walked through the door that evening, his suit pressed, his face calm, his folder tucked neatly under his arm, I knew it wasn't a bluff. The following week, I sat across from him at the lawyer's office, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, my mind racing for excuses. Ryan sat straight, his expression composed, his silence steady, his posture unshakable, and he looked every bit the man I had mocked. The lawyer read through the terms, assets divided fairly, accounts split cleanly, responsibilities outlined with precision, and I barely heard the words over the sound of my panic. I tried to interrupt, tried to speak, tried to spin, telling them I had only been joking, telling them humor had been my way of showing love. I said Ryan was overreacting, said he was too sensitive, said everyone teased their spouses, but the lawyer only nodded politely, and Ryan said nothing. His silence was more damning than words. his calmness sharper than accusations, his detachment proof that I no longer mattered. I begged then, dropping arrogance for desperation, telling Ryan I could change, telling him I would stop joking, telling him I never meant harm. I said he was abandoning me unfairly, said he was throwing away years of loyalty, said he was destroying our marriage over nothing. My words tumbled out quickly, frantic, messy, but Ryan never looked at me, never responded, never broke his composure. He signed each page slowly, carefully, sliding them across the table with deliberate movements, and my stomach sank lower each time his pen touched paper. Linda and Paul were not in the room, but I felt their presence anyway, their judgment heavy, their loyalty behind their son unshakable. I remembered Linda's sharp words, Paul's quiet disappointment, and I realized they had been right all along, while I had laughed at them. When the lawyer confirmed everything was final, Ryan stood calmly, adjusted his jacket, lifted his folder, and left without a word. He didn't slam the door, didn't look back, didn't even hesitate, only walked away with the same quiet strength that had humiliated me all along. I sat there trembling, tears smudging my makeup, clutching the unsigned copy of my own defeat, while the lawyer cleared the papers neatly. I wanted to scream, wanted to tear the documents, wanted to call Ryan back, but all I had was silence pressing down on me. That silence felt heavier than the law itself, heavier than the judgment of friends, heavier than the disappointment of family. It was the silence of a man who had finally chosen himself, finally chosen respect, finally chosen dignity over me. In the days that followed, I tried everything, calling his phone repeatedly, leaving messages, sending long texts filled with apologies, explanations, promises. I told him I had only been insecure, told him I had only wanted attention, told him I had only meant to be funny. But my calls went unanswered, my texts unread, my apologies ignored, my promises irrelevant, and the silence remained absolute. Friends avoided me entirely now, their pity replaced by disdain, their distance final, their loyalty redirected fully toward Ryan. Even Trevor stopped engaging, his smirks gone, his shallow compliments silenced, his interest evaporated the moment my marriage collapsed. I realized then that he had never admired me, only entertained himself while I destroyed my own life. Ryan seemed to shine brighter with every passing day, his name spoken with respect, his silence celebrated, his presence admired, while I sank into shadows I had created myself. I mocked him as boring and ordinary, but he emerged strong and dignified, earning admiration I never thought he deserved. The man I ridiculed for early mornings and plain boots became the man others praised for building something lasting, while I was left humiliated, forgotten, erased. That office meeting was the moment arrogance turned to desperation, where sarcasm collapsed into silence, and I realized too late that my words had destroyed more than feelings. Ryan's patience had been strategy, his calmness strength, his silence power, and I had underestimated all of it. He fired me from his life with the same steady composure I once ridiculed, and the silence he left behind screamed louder than every laugh I had ever chased. Weeks after the divorce, I saw him again at a community event. His name was on banners, his smile steady as he cut the ribbon for a new playground project. Children cheered, parents applauded, neighbors praised his leadership, and I stood invisible at the edge, wrapped in a borrowed coat. The man I had mocked for being dull now stood admired by everyone, while I shrank smaller with every clap. From then on, I could not escape stories of his success, his promotions, his projects, his growing reputation. Even Linda and Paul, whose warnings I ignored, now glowed with pride at their son, while former friends who once laughed at my jokes now praised him instead. The worst cut came when I tried to approach him. He smiled warmly at strangers, shook hands with colleagues, but his gaze slid past me as if I didn't exist. That indifference was colder than hate, proving I had no place left in his world. Nights replayed every cruel joke I had ever made, every sarcastic remark I mistook for wit, and I finally saw myself clearly, not clever but cruel, not bold but arrogant, not strong but weak. Ryan's silence had been strength all along, and my laughter had been destruction. He erased me quietly, permanently, and I am left watching from the outside, nothing more than a whispered cautionary tale. His silence became unforgettable justice, and I will never escape it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching, 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 watching.